There are stories that live in the red earth of the highlands, stories older than the acacia trees that bend against the wind. This is one of them. They say that long ago, before the railway cut through the savannah, before borders were drawn on maps, there lived a shepherd named Kamau. He was not a rich man. He was not a powerful man, but he possessed something rare. He listened when the world spoke. Kamau lived in the shadow of Mount Kirinyaga, that great mountain the colonial maps would later call by another name. His home was a small stone hut with a roof of dried grass, and his wealth consisted of 47 goats, each one known to him by name and temperament. Every morning, before the sun burned the mist from the valleys, Kamau would lead his herd up the hillsides, where the grass grew sweet and thick. He knew every path, every water source, every place where leopards might wait in the long shadows of evening. The other shepherds thought him strange because he walked alone, because he did not join their conversations at the watering holes, because he seemed to prefer the company of silence. But Kamau was not unfriendly. He simply understood that silence has its own language. His wife, Nyambara, was a woman of practical wisdom. She kept their small shamba, their garden, with the same care Kamau gave his goats. She grew beans and maize and sweet potatoes, and she knew the healing properties of every plant that grew on the mountainside. In the evenings, they would sit together outside their hut, and she would tell him the news from the market, the marriages and births, the disputes between neighbors, all the human weather that fills a community. Kamau would listen, nodding, but his eyes often drifted to the horizon where clouds gathered and dispersed according to rhythms only they understood. "You are here, but not here," Nyambara would say, not unkindly. "Where does your mind go, husband?" "I am listening," he would reply. "To what?" "I am the one speaking." "To everything else." She would shake her head, but there was affection in her exasperation. After 15 years of marriage, she knew this was simply who he was. The trouble began in the season of long rains that failed to arrive. At first, no one worried. The rains had been late before. But as weeks passed and the sky remained a hard, bright blue, anxiety crept into the village like a thief. The maize in the fields grew stunted and yellow. The river that ran through the valley shrank to a trickle, then to scattered pools of muddy water. The goats grew thin. The cattle, those symbols of wealth and status, began to die. The elders called a meeting. They sat in a circle under the great fig tree that had stood in the village center for more generations than anyone could count. The young men argued for driving the herds to distant grazing lands. The women worried about the children, already showing the slight swelling of bellies that comes from hunger. The old men spoke of droughts they had survived before, but their voices carried uncertainty. Finally, it was decided. They would consult Wanjiru, the old woman who lived alone on the far side of the mountain. Some called her a prophet, others called her mad, but everyone agreed she knew things that ordinary people did not. The journey to Wanjiru's dwelling took half a day. Kamau went with 3 elders, climbing higher into the mountain than most people ever ventured. The path was steep and rocky, winding through groves of giant bamboo that creaked and whispered in the wind. They found her sitting outside a cave, so old she seemed almost transparent, as if she were becoming part of the mountain itself. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but when she turned her face toward them, Kamau felt certain she could see more clearly than any of them. "The rain has forgotten you," she said before anyone spoke. The eldest of the group, a man named Gitanga, cleared his throat. "Mother, we have come to ask. I know why you have come. You want me to tell you when the rain will return?" "Yes, Mother." "The rain will return when someone remembers how to speak its language." The elders looked at each other, confused. Gitanga tried again. "Mother, we do not understand? What language? Should we make sacrifices? Should we? But Wanjiru had already turned her face away, back toward the valley below. The audience was over. On the walk back down the mountain, the elders debated what her words meant. They talked of old rituals that had been abandoned, of sacred sites that had been neglected, of offenses against the ancestors that needed to be put right. Kamau said nothing, but her words had planted themselves in his mind like seeds in fertile soil. That night, Kamau could not sleep. He rose while Nyambura still dreamed and walked out into the darkness. The stars overhead were so bright they seemed to hum with their own light. He walked without destination, letting his feet find their own way, until he stood on a high outcropping of rock overlooking the valley. Below, he could see the scattered lights of cooking fires, already burning low as families settled into sleep. Above, the vast wheel of the galaxy turned with patient indifference, and all around, the night spoke in its many voices, the chirping of insects, the distant cough of a leopard, the rustle of small creatures in the dry grass. Kamau closed his eyes and listened, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. He listened the way he had always listened, but now with intention, with purpose. He listened to the whisper of wind through the drought-brittle leaves. He listened to the creak of tree branches, to the scuttle of beetles, to the beating of his own heart. And slowly, very slowly, he began to hear patterns. The wind did not blow randomly. It rose and fell in rhythms, like breathing. The insects did not chirp in chaos, but in waves of sound that ebbed and flowed. Even the dry grass rasping against itself seemed to carry meaning, if only he could decipher it. He stood there until the sky began to pale in the east, until the night sounds gave way to the first tentative calls of birds greeting the dawn. When he returned home, Nyambura was awake, grinding millet for their morning porridge. "Where did you go?" she asked. "To listen," he said. She looked at him with worry in her eyes. "Husband, you are not eating enough. This drought is making you strange." But Kamau only smiled and went to check on his goats. From that night forward, Kamau became a student of the world's speech. Each day, as he led his goats across the parched hillsides, he paid attention to everything. He noticed that certain birds appeared before changes in the weather. He observed that the goats became restless when storms were building, even when the sky showed no sign of clouds. He watched how the ants moved their colonies to higher ground, how the termites sealed their mounds, how the spiders spun their webs in patterns that seemed to predict the wind. But it was the clouds that became his greatest teachers. Even in drought, clouds still formed. They would build on the horizon in the heat of the afternoon, great white towers that promised rain but delivered nothing. Kamau watched them with the attention a scholar gives to ancient texts. He saw how they moved, how they formed and dissolved, how their shapes shifted with invisible currents of air. And gradually he began to understand that clouds were not just water vapor. They were conversations. They spoke to the mountains and the mountains spoke back. They spoke to the wind and the wind carried their messages across vast distances. They spoke to the earth, and the earth responded with heat and moisture, sending messages upward in return. The problem, Kamau realized, was that the conversation had broken down. The earth was crying out in thirst, but the clouds no longer heard. Or perhaps they heard but could not answer. The language between them had become garbled, confused, lost. "I need to learn their words," Kamau said aloud one afternoon, standing alone on a hilltop. His youngest goat, a kid with a white patch on her forehead, looked up at him and bleated, as if in agreement. Nyambura knew something was changing in her husband. He had always been a quiet man, but now his silences had a different quality, deeper, more distant. He would stand motionless for long periods, his face turned skyward, his lips moving slightly as if in prayer or conversation. "The others are talking," she told him one evening. "They say you have gone mad from the drought." "Perhaps I have," Kamau replied. "Or perhaps I am becoming sane for the first time." "What does that mean?" He turned to her and she was struck by the intensity in his eyes. "Nyambura, what if the old woman was right? What if rain does have a language and we have forgotten how to speak it? Rain is rain, husband. It comes or it doesn't come. We can pray. We can make sacrifices, but we cannot control it. I do not want to control it. I want to speak with it, to ask it to return." She studied his face in the firelight. "And have you learned this language?" "I am beginning to. But there is one thing I do not understand yet." "What is that?" "What the rain wants in return." Nyambura felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening. "What do you mean, what it wants?" "Every conversation has two sides. I can learn to speak to the rain, but why should it listen? Why should it answer? There must be an exchange." "You are frightening me." Kamau reached out and took her hands. "Do not be frightened. I'm trying to save us. All of us." That night he dreamed of rain for the first time in months. In the dream, he stood in a downpour so heavy he could barely see. The rain was not cold but warm, almost blood temperature, and it spoke to him in a voice that was both many. Thunder rolled across the mountain, not threatening but jubilant, like drums celebrating a festival. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in stark flashes of white. And Kamau stood in the center of it all, his arms spread wide, his face turned upward, letting the rain soak him to the bone. He was the witness. He was the one who remembered. He was the bridge between earth and sky, between people and rain, between forgetting and remembering. The storm raged for hours. The rain fell so heavily that waterfalls appeared on the mountain sides, cascading down slopes that had been dry for months. The parched earth drank and finally could drink no more. And streams began to form, rushing downward, joining together, becoming rivers. In the valley below, people ran from their homes, laughing and crying at once. They stood in the rain with their faces raised, letting it wash away months of dust and despair. Children danced in puddles. Women held out basins and pots to catch the precious water. Men shouted prayers of thanksgiving to whatever god they held dear. And on the mountain, Kamau stood in the rain until his legs could no longer hold him. He sank to his knees, then to his side, curling around himself as the storm raged on. The rain had returned, and he had kept his promise. They found him 2 days later. Nyambura had sent men to search when he did not come home. They climbed the mountain, following the muddy paths, and discovered him on the stone shelf, unconscious but alive, his skin cold as river water. They carried him down carefully, wrapped in blankets, taking turns bearing his weight. By the time they reached the village, he was beginning to stir, his eyes fluttering open, his lips forming words they could not understand. Nyambura nursed him back to health slowly, patiently. She fed him broth and wrapped him in warm cloths and sat by his side through the nights when fever made him shake and mutter. On the 5th day, he woke fully, his eyes clear. "The rain came," he said. "Yes," Nyambura replied, tears streaming down her face. "The rain came. You fool, you beautiful fool. The rain came and you almost died. But I did not die. No, you did not die." He reached up and touched her face. "I learned the language, Nyambura. I learned how to speak to the rain." "I know. Everyone knows. They are calling you prophet, holy man, rainmaker." Kamau shook his head weakly. I am none of those things. I am only someone who learned to listen. The rains continued for the rest of the season, not constant but regular, falling in the rhythms the land needed. The crops recovered, the rivers filled, the cattle and goats grew fat once more. The crisis passed. But something had changed in the village, in the whole region. People began to pay attention differently. They noticed the signs they had ignored, the behavior of birds and insects, the patterns of clouds, the language of the wind. The old knowledge, which had been slipping away, was suddenly valued again. Parents taught their children to watch the weather as Kamau watched it. Farmers consulted the sky before planting. Shepherds learned to read the signs that Kamau had discovered. And Kamau himself became a teacher, though he never sought the role. People would come to him with questions. Is the rain coming? Will the harvest be good? What do the clouds mean? He would answer when he could, but more often he would say, look for yourself. Listen, the world is always speaking. You only need to pay attention. He lived for many more years, Kamau the shepherd who had learned the rain's language. His goats multiplied again. His home remained simple, but he was content in a way that wealth could never provide. Sometimes in the evenings, he and Nyambura would sit outside their hut as they always had, watching the sky. Do you still speak to the rain? She would ask. Every day, he would reply. Not with words, just by remembering, by being grateful. That is all it ever wanted, to be seen, to be honored, to be loved. And does it answer? Kamau would smile. What do you think? Look at the fields. Look at the rivers. Look at the children playing in the puddles after the afternoon showers. The rain answers every day. And so the story ends, as all stories must. But the lesson continues, passed down from generation to generation, not just in that village, but anywhere people remember to listen, to watch, to pay attention to the world's speech. Because rain does have a language, as do wind and stone, river and root, cloud and earth. Comment where you are watching from, and we can learn it if we choose to. All it requires is that we stop treating the world as a thing to be used and start treating it as a voice to be heard. A partner in the great conversation of existence. Kamau understood this. He was not a prophet or a holy man. He was simply someone who learned to listen. And in listening, he saved his people.